Department of English Studies Thursday webinar series during this lockdown that we started. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Akhlaq Ahan, who teaches at Jawaharlal Nehru University as today's esteemed guest. So today he will be speaking about ghazals, and for me, so it is one of the most evocative forms of expression. Ghazal holds a special place in the creative tradition in both the Middle East as well as in India. And my first experience of this consciously was through the ghazals sung by the legendary Jagjit Singh ji, and then later on I came across the poetry of Mirza Ghalib, and later Amir Khosrow, and through the poetry of Rumi. And it has been a fabulous experience for me to read some of them, although I don't claim to understand most of it. So it's like a and it is basically, so it's a privilege to have you. Today we have seen that it has entered into a uh, very soul and heart of the Indian aesthetic tradition. Uh, as part of the entire scheme of the aesthetics of this form of poetry. So we are privileged today to have with us Professor Akhlaq Ahan. He is a scholar par excellence of Persian as well as Urdu, and he is a professor of Persian language and literature at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is the author of numerous anthologies of poetry in both Persian and Urdu, and is well known not only in India but also in the countries of Iran and Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan, where his books and his critical works are part of the syllabus that is taught in the universities. So he is also an acclaimed poet himself. He writes both in Urdu as well as in Persian. And without any further ado, I would welcome him to this platform, and the stage is his for the next 45 minutes or so. Professor Ahan.
Thanks, Professor Shantanu Ghosh. It's a great delight to be invited by the Department of English Studies, Akal University. And it's a great delight to see you and friends here. The topic, as it is announced, Ghazal and its development, it's a interesting topic, and though we can talk a lot and for hours on the topic, but as there is time limit, I would like to be brief and to discuss the main features of Ghazal. What is Ghazal? It's etymological and epistemic background, as well as the historical journey of Ghazal through the period. Vis-a-vis, as Professor Ghosh had asked me, I would also recite my own poetry as an example, vis-a-vis also the examples from other poets. Ghazal uh, is basically a word from Arabic language. Its origin is from there, and the basic meaning of its root is spinning, and the figurative sense of this word is having amorous talks with women, flirting, like moghazilat, talking to women, must have led to the association with the erotic poetry that was available in or the prevalent in Arabic language. Uh, in Arabic, the word can be used to denote the subject matter of this kind of poetry in general, as well as an individual love poem written in any format, not in the current format we know as Ghazal. So it was also any format of poetry uh, having the description of love and its experiences used to be called as moghazilat. For a period of time, the same ambiguity existed in Persian also, because it later came to Persian. It was introduced by Arabs in Persia, but eventually, ghazal became specialized as the term for a specific love poem defined by a set of prosodic rules, certain thematic and stylistic conventions, and an equally conventional stock of imagery. Uh, uh, so, uh, the but personally, I have also researched on this word, how it is derived. For me, and I have written also about, but I will just briefly mention here that ghazal is derived from ghazal. Ghazal is a kind of deer or antelope, uh, and we know that it bears a thing that is called musk or musk, and when it is ripe, it goes the antelope goes into solitude and cries, and that cry is called ghazal. And since the theme of the ghazal is love, separation, agony of separation, it is also the reason why this form of poetry, this genre of poetry, is called as ghazal. And the cognate or similar word, tagazzul, is a generic term for love poetry. And we also know that this ghazal became this was not an independent genre in poetry recognized. In Persian, earlier it was part of qasida. As we know, qasida, the form of poetry which was written and recited to appreciate, to flirt a king or ruler. And the first portion of the poetry used to be called as tashbib or tamheed. And the theme of that portion of qasida was separated later and became ghazal. So because the theme was similar to the ghazal, the love and experiences related to that. As a formal genre, the Persian ghazals is governed by a combination of rules, all of which are to be strictly observed, though no one is exclusive to this type of poem. The rhyming scheme is based on monorhyme with internal rhyme in the opening line is called matla. For example, I would recite ghazal. Matla is basically horizon. So the first couplet of the ghazal and every verse of that is rhymed. For example, नहीं मालूम दिल क्यों जल रहा है मगर है गम कोई जो पल रहा है. So you can see raha hai and raha hai is repeated, and jal and pal are rhymed. So jal and pal are kafiya, and raha hai that will be repeated in every couplet of this ghazal is radif. Radif is also you can call it uh, uh, the queue. The literal meaning of radif is queue. So that first couplet, that is also called as bath, or in Urdu it is also called as sher, uh, consisting two misra or verse, uh, uh, and being rhymed, each misra is called as matla, the first one. And in some of the ghazals, the second couplet is also having the similar structure, is called as husne matla. Means the second couplet, every verse or the both of the verse have kafiya and radif. So and the length of the ghazal generally vary from 5 to 13, some say 15, and most of the ghazals, you can say 99% of the ghazals are in between that. And this is not a long format. So they are restricted between 5. Even we have sometimes 4 couplets in one ghazal. And if you see the Diwan-e-Ghalib, there are even less and more also. But generally it varies between 5 couplets to 15 or 13 maybe. So that is the structural part. Another feature of the ghazal is radif, as I mentioned, consisting of an independent word or a phrase or a personal suffix added repeatedly to each rhyme or kafia. It is optional, but it occurs very frequently in ghazal because it gives a semantic coherence of some kind to the lines of the poem, which are often only loosely connected. Actually, the radif is one of the extra rules allowed by uh, the, the, the ghazal rhyme, and may therefore be applied to any poem. So for example, I just recited the ghazal for नहीं मालूम दिल क्यों जल रहा है मगर है गम कोई जो पल रहा है कोई तो है जो रोजो शब मचलता कहीं अंदर ही अंदर चल रहा है वो दिलकश दिलरुबा चेहरा तबस्सुम निगाहों में जो बसकर छल रहा है. So you can see raha hai is repeated, and this is radif, and the kafiya, the rhyme is jal pal chal dhal chal. So that is you can see in every ghazal. This is the established form of ghazal. The technical ghazal is marked in particular by the mention of poet's name, and that generally comes in the last. So, and that is called as makta at the conclusion of the poem. Uh, for example, Ghalib says, like, बनाकर फकीरों का हम भेष गालिब तमाशाए अहले करम देखते हैं. So he has used, and every ghazal poet generally uses his takhallus or pen name or maybe pseudonym in the last of the ghazal, that is called as maqta. And here in maqta, the poet introduces a personal reference into the poem, speaking either to himself or about himself as the third person. The motive used in this maqta could be the identification of the poet with the lover who is speaking the text, but also the boost of the poet's literary skill. For example, uh, 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 रेख्ता के तुम ही उस्ताद नहीं हो गालिब, कहते हैं अगले जमाने में कोई मीर भी था. So sometimes poets tend to talk about their own expertise in the ghazal, and sometimes they recognize or compare their poetry to the great masters. Uh, uh, this takhallus is a term which also comes to denote, as I told, pen name or the pseudonym. In Persian literary theory, however, this takhallus occurs in its original meaning, that is, in transition from the prologue to the praise of a patron in the structure of qasida. So in qasida, they also use it, but in different way that differs from the ghazal. All the common Persian meters are also used in Urdu ghazal, because Urdu ghazal is primarily inspired by the Persian ghazal, and there is a meter structure. So all the meters of this tradition of Persian Urdu is used in ghazal, except the meter of Rubai. Rubai has a different uh, uh, structure. So the language of the poem should be elegant, uh, classical. The ghazal has a very sensitive language it should have, and a ghazal writer must be sensitive to that. Though we see in the contemporary ghazal writing people using different kind of even the colloquial the words, but generally in the classical tradition they prefer to use the elegant uh, 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 words, which is one of the one hand devoid of vulgarism, and on the other hand full of intricate learned illusions and extravagant hyperbole. The rhetorical embellishment should be less than in a um, of the qasida, but on the figures of meaning, amphibological ambiguity, that is called ilham, iham, sorry. So, for example, there is a classic iham in Urdu, मगस को बाग में जाने न देना कि नाहक खून परवाने का होगा. So it is iham. Generally, if you see it, there is no connection between magas. Magas means makhi, and honey bee, and बाग में जाने न देना कि नाहा खून परवाने का होगा. So apparently we don't see any connection between the honeybee going to the garden and the parwana being sacrificed on the shama. So but there is a connection if you connect it. So that is called iham, and it was very popular once upon a time in the Persian ghazal, and that was also later used in Urdu ghazal. And irony are conspicuous in ghazal poetry of the particular of its style and language. By far, the most important is the tendency to treat individual lines as separate units. This is also a very basic characteristic of Ghazal, that every couplet of a ghazal, though it is a short format of poetry, but every couplet from the meaning point of view is independent. So you, that's why you see generally that people use just one couplet to express their, unlike poem or nazm, that you have to quote the whole nazm to convey the sense. In ghazal, just one couplet, it's an independent and autonomous entity from the point of view of conveying the meaning to people. So that is a very basic uh, characteristic of couplets of ghazal. Of the particular of style and language, by far the most important is the tendency to treat individual lines as separate units, which greatly increase in the course of the ghazal's long history. Earlier, we also see some of the ghazals from the matla to makhta, having same kind of meaning or conveying the same theme, discussing the same theme. But later, this tendency developed. The ghazal is further distinguished by its subject matter. Uh, 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 the subject is the first place connected to the genre of, as I told, erotic poetry, though poems of this kind usually include a great variety of themes, description of nature, uh, uh, and uh, like wine, the description of nature and wine songs are fully integrated elements in ghazal. Antinomian motifs centered around the poetic types of the qalandar and rend, that is called as rind in Urdu, and mingle with references to sometime you can say takfiriyat or kufriyat, or so also became closely associated with this form of poetry. What makes the ghazal into a quite distinct kind of poetry in its unique blend of formal and thematic features, providing it with an unmistakable poetical aura which holds the secret of its exceptional popularity throughout centuries. And we know that ghazal is, and as mentioned also here, that it is the most popular form of poetry, not only in Urdu, in Persian, and that's why in the subcontinent and Central Asia and Iran. This variety of subject matter provided the ghazal with rich imagery, which could easily be used for symbolization and allegorization. It became a very apt medium for mystical poetry also. And I would also add that in its beginning, when ghazal was separated from qasida and became an independent form of poetry, one of the reasons of being it was because of the attack of Mongols on Central Asia and Iran, and that resulted into the decline of courts, courts of the kings and amirs and nobles, and the poets became ascetics, and there was a whole kind of devastation in the whole this part of the world. So Sufism emerged, and the Sufi chose this form of poetry. And the first person who is credited to establish ghazal as the independent form of poetry was Sadi. And he was a mystic poet, and his contemporary Rumi, we all know, and later Hafiz, and then Amir Khus, almost contemporary of Saadi is Amir Khusro, a great ghazal poet. And then we see the same tendency coming into and adopted into Urdu, and now we see also in Hindi. And that's why one of the major theme, or one of the principal theme of ghazal poetry is mysticism. Though this is again expressed through the symbols, the idioms of love, of the same eyes and Zulfe and Rukhayar, uh, uh, but they do have layered meaning. One of the characteristic of the ghazal is it does not have the abstract meaning, or a direct kind of meaning. It has a layered meaning, and particularly those who have the mastery over this craft of ghazal composing, their ghazal have different layers of meaning. So you can translate it or interpret it in a different way. So as I mentioned that uh, uh, the variety of the subject matter provided the ghazal, which is rich imagery, which could easily be used by symbolization and allegorization. It became a very apt medium for the mystical poetry. Its use for this purpose is actually known since the beginning of the recorded history of the ghazal. However, the links with the profane love poetry were never completely severed. In the best specimen, a subtle balance between the possibilities of transcendental and secular references is also mentioned here. I will come to that. And as I mentioned that even the mystic poetry is explained through the typical ghazal symbols like sharab, bada, sagar, and for example, Ghalib says that har chand ho mushahede haq ki guftgu banti nahi hai bado sagar kahe bagair. Though the talk is about the experience of the ultimate truth, yet we cannot do it without mentioning wine and goblet. So that is the beauty of poetry. Uh, Independent ghazal and its origin, as I mentioned, in the erotic, from the erotic qasida, it was the erotic part of the qasida, it was derived during the 12th, 13th century and onwards. So as I mentioned, Sadi, and then his contemporaries like Sanai and Rumi, and then Amir Khusro, and then Hafiz, and many others. The erotic prologues of the pre-Islamic Arabic Qasida lived on as a convention in the panegyrics or Qasida court poetry, though greatly changed thematically. And uh, now I will come to about the Urdu poetry and its different phases. Uh, 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 but before that, I will also a little mention about this format. Uh, uh, that Ghazal, a short lyric poem that is between 5 to 15 or 13 uh, uh, couplets. The unit of Ghazal, as in most other forms of the Persian poetry, is a line that is called Bayt, and in Urdu we also call it Sher, comprising two misra, that is the verse. Uh, and as a rule, each line contains a complete statement. Uh, uh, Sometimes the entire poetic statement is continued in one hemistich, and the second hemistich is then used to either emphasize the idea expressed in the first hemistich. For example, patta patta boota boota haal hamara jane hai. It can also be used as a full meaning, but to stress upon and to explain more, जाने न जाने गुल ही न जाने बाग तो सारा जाने है. So, or reiterate in a different way, or illustrate it, or to introduce else as mere padding or to complete the meter. So because it has to be, the ghazal has to be in a particular format, it cannot deviate from that. uh, in a sense, one can say that each line of a ghazal uh, uh, is often a short poem in which a poetic idea, theme, or motive is expressed, such as a description of a beloved's beauty, a lament of the poet's separation from the beloved, a praise of wine, an inebriation, a description of a natural scene such as a garden, satire of a hypocrisy, or an allegory of the lover's state. So, if someone, for instance, reciting one couplet, he does not require to express to decide the whole ghazal for expressing the matter. For instance, you can say, आह को चाहिए एक उम्र असर होने तक, कौन जीता है तेरी जुल्फ के सर होने तक. So this one couplet is enough to express the matter. Or for example, हमने माना कि तगाफुल न करोगे लेकिन खाक हो जाएंगे हम तुमको खबर होने तक. So here is another theme being mentioned, a kind of lamentation of the poet who is in agony of separation. Or for instance, Iqbal saying that pila ke, or for example, about the wine kind of, or the khumriyat, for instance, uh, uh, like Jigar Muradabadi saying, ऐ रहमते तमाम मेरी हर खता मुआफ, मैं इंतहाए शौक में घबरा के पी गया, और सरमस्त ये अजल मुझे मालूम जब हुई, दुनिया एतबार को ठुकरा के पी गया. So here another theme is sorry, being mentioned. Or for instance, there are different themes in the poetry. Or for example, one poet describing the themes of the ghazal saying that husn mail bas sitam ho to ghazal hoti hai, ishq ba deed-e nam ho to ghazal hoti hai, और कभी दुनिया हो कभी तुम कभी तकदीर खिलाफ, रोज एक ताज़ा सितम हो तो गजल होती है। और शिकने गेसवे दौरा ही पे मौकूफ नहीं, उनकी जुल्फों में भी खम हो तो गजल होती है। और फॉर इंस्टांस मीर saying or expressing a kind of as I mentioned uh, 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 the theme of like uh, uh, a sarcasm on the religion. That is also one of the themes of ghazal. For example, मीर के दीनो मजहब का क्या पूछो हो भाई, उनने तो कशका खींचा दैर में बैठा, कब का तर्क इस्लाम किया. So this kind of and it has a different layered meaning though in it, but these are also the favorite themes of the ghazal, as I mentioned. Then I will come to the different periods of the ghazal of Urdu particularly. As I mentioned, it has come from the Persian and how it is started in 12th and 13th century, and then it coming to and introduced to the Indian subcontinent. And the poets of Urdu, Hindavi, for instance, the earliest the examples of ghazal writing in Urdu or Hindavi tradition was by Amir Khusro. Uh, uh, for instance, you might have heard that Zehal miski makun tagaful दुराए नैना बनाए बतियां, किताब हिजरा न दारा मैजा न काहे लेऊ लगाए छतियां. So this is also showing, and this ghazal is attributed to Amir Khusro, though we do not find it in his diwan. But nonetheless, it shows the earlier style of the ghazal. Then we have Kabir in the 16th century. हमन का है इश्क मस्ताना, हमन को होशियारी क्या, रहे आजाद या जग से हमन दुनिया से यारी क्या. And the first established ghazal writer of Urdu nonetheless can be called Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah. He was a Qutub Shahi king and a poet, a great poet, having a whole divan of his Hindavi or Urdu poetry. And you might have heard Piya Baj Pyala Piya Jaina, Piya bin Ektil Jia Jaina. So these are the earliest, I think, the earliest phase of Urdu poetry or ghazal in India and in Urdu Hindavi tradition. Then the second phase is coming to from Deccan, coming to the north. The first person who visited from Deccan to north and propagating the Urdu poetry, though it was there already, as I mentioned, Kabir and Amir Khusro and Gulshan and others. But in an organized way, the tradition of Urdu poetry starts in the 18th century. In 1700, Wali Dakkani came to Delhi, and he was primarily a Urdu poet, a Dakkani poet. And here in Delhi, there was tradition of Persian ghazal poetry. Bedil was here. So seeing it, the second generation post Bedil, we see the poets like Hatim, like Mazhar Jane Jana, and Dard Dehlvi. He was a mystic poet. And then after that, the second generation of Delhi and North Indian ghazal poets are Mir, the great Mir, Taqi Mir, Sauda, and Mir पत्ता पत्ता बूटा बूटा हाल हमारा जाने है, जाने न जाने गुल ही न जाने बाग तो सारा जाने है. और फॉर इंस्टांस, उल्टी हो गई सब तदबीरें, कुछ न दवा ने काम किया, आखिर इस बीमारी दिल ने मेरा काम तमाम किया. Then we see a decline of Delhi, political as well as the cultural and civilizational decline because of the chaos of that period. And then we see the migration of poets to the Awadh. Awadh started patronizing the poets of different areas. And then we see in the 19th century poets like Insha, Mushafi, Nasikh, Atish, these great Ghazal poets. They कमर बांधे हुए, for instance, इंशा, कमर बांधे हुए चलने को यहाँ सब यार बैठे हैं, बहुत आगे गए बाकी जो हैं तैयार बैठे हैं, और न छेड़े निखते बागे बहारी, राह लग अपनी तुझे अटके लिया सूझी हम बेजार बैठे हैं. And then again we see a revival of poetry and the cultural milieu in Delhi. And particularly during the period of the most declining from the political point of view, the period of Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal poet. And during his period, again, Delhi becoming the center of the Ghazal poets and poets as well. And we see the great poets like Zauq, Ghalib, Momin, and Bahadur Shah Zafar himself, a great poet of Ghazal. And for instance, the famous ghazal of Bahadur Shah Zafar, न किसी की आंख का नूर हूँ, न किसी के दिल का करार हूँ, जो किसी के काम न आ सका, मैं वो एक मुश्त गुबार हूँ. And the whole ghazal you might have heard from the singers as well. And the Zauq, चुपके गम का खाना कोई हमसे सीख जाए, जो हो जी में दिल मिलाना कोई हमसे सीख जाए. Or similarly, the poets like Ghalib, you know, I recited many of his couplets. हजारों ख्वाहिशें ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, बहुत निकले मेरे अरमान लेकिन फिर भी कम निकले. And many of his ghazals, कोई उम्मीद बर नहीं आती, कोई सूरत नजर नहीं आती. And from the ghazal point of view, we can say that Mir and Ghalib were probably the greatest ghazal poets. Yeah, Momin is also contemporary of Ghalib. वो जो हम में तुम में करार था, तुम्हें याद हो कि न याद हो, वही आना यानी वादा निभाह का, तुम्हें याद हो कि न याद हो. So that is Momin. And then we see with the decline of Delhi with 1857, we see the developing or coming up of different centers of poetry patronized by the local Nawabs and Rajas and kings. For instance, Rampur, for instance, Azimabad, that was Patna, and Hyderabad again. So these were Calcutta and Bengal. These were the centers of the ghazals, and we see many poets, for instance, from Rampur, Amir Minai is a great poet. Then you have Dagh migrating from Delhi to Hyderabad, and he is also a great poet. Then we have 20th century, and in 20th century we have also many great poets of Ghazal particularly. And there are four Ghazal poets who are called as Anasir Arba of Ghazal writing, or the four elements of Ghazal writing. They are Fani, Hasrat, Asghar, and Jigar. Fani is basically known, we can call him as a Keats of Urdu literature, because he mostly talks of pessimistic or romanticist themes. For example, हर नफस उम्र गुज़श्ता की है मैयत फानी, जिंदगी नाम है मर मर के जिए जाने का. Or for Jigar, Jigar is also a very good poet of ghazal. He says, for instance, लबे नैसे सुनाए थे किसी ने जो नगमे लबे जिगर से मुकर्रर सुनाए जाते हैं. Then Asghar is talking of mystic themes, and after them we have many poets, and then there is another movement, as we know, progressive movement. So there are many poets inspired by the progressive movement, and having and also deviating from the classical themes, and talking of the theme, they are inspired ideologically also. So among them are, for example, Makhdoom, Majaz, Lakhnavi, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Jazbi, Majruh. These are the poets. But among the contemporaries and a little senior, and as mentioned, that those four poets and this, there are many poets who are having the classical style, and they are Josh, Faraq, Hafiz, Akhtar Sherani. And again, we have the contemporary poet. The tradition goes on, and it is one of the most popular, as I mentioned in the beginning, genre of Urdu poetry. And we have poets like Ahmad Faraz and many others in the subcontinent, and those migrated from here to different areas. So we have poets like Khurshid Rizvi, Irfan Sattar, Farhat Esas, and many others. And among even the younger generation. So the tradition thrives and goes on, and you would certainly enjoy reading, listening to ghazals. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Akhlaq, for this extremely interesting, in a short span of time, rendition of the history and the development of the ghazal as a genre and its various different aspects. So there are a couple of questions that have come in. Will it be possible for you to answer them?
Yeah. Surely,
Briefly?
I'd love to. So,
Briefly,
if
one
there's any
one question
question,
that has come
yeah.
is that I remember you compared this this movement to the romantic movement, Shelley, Keats, Byron. What are the similarities or what are the differences?
See the similarities, as I mentioned, that Fani is particularly a poet of discussing mainly the themes related to the what we call in Urdu the dakhili, or the internal emotional part of a human being. For example, death, for example, separation. So 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 that's why I compared it. Not exactly every aspect. The way Shelley or Keats and the other romanticist poets did. It was a kind of literary movement, but Fani was not part of any literary movement, but he himself individually uh, 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 dealt with these issues. And that was basically based on his own personal experiences. So that's why I just mentioned that he resembles the way Fani and the way the romanticist poets do. For example, जब्त अपना शिकार था न रहा, दिल पे कुछ इख्तियार था न रहा, उनकी बेमेहरियों का क्या मालूम, कोई उम्मीदवार था न रहा, और तर्क तदबीर को भी देख लिया, ये भी तदबीर कारगर न हुई. Or for instance about death, lots of talk about death, uh, 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 like हर नफस उम्र गुज़श्ता की है मैयत फानी, जिंदगी नाम है मर मर के जिए जाने का. यानी जो सांस लेता हूँ, जो सांस निकल रहा होता है, वो उस लम्हे की मैयत होती है, कॉफिन होती है, जो सांस के साथ चली जा रही होती है. So that theme is overwhelmingly present in the Fani's poetry. Yeah.
Yeah. Second question is from Dr. Harish.
Yeah.
So he says that on one side, some kind of filmy ghazals, I mean, I think he means Bollywood style ghazals, is dying, while on the other side, hundreds of young ghazal writers are coming up on social media. How would you see these two developments?
See, these two developments are, I always call it basically due to it has its historical background. Uh, we cannot deny that somehow the present generation for last at least 50, 70 years is separated from the classical tradition we had in Indian subcontinent. The tradition of that was coming from Sanskrit to Persian and later coming to Hindi, Urdu, Bangla, and other traditions. But somehow we got separated, whatsoever it was. It was either the socio-cultural milieu or the education system we had in our academic institutions. Uh, we got separated from this classical tradition of poetry and education, and that really is reflected into our literary taste also. So that's why we see the poetry, even the film industry, they use the regular poetry from Ghalib, from even Faz or Sahir, and these are the poetry which we can say that that follows the norms of the poetry. But later, particularly in 70s onwards, we see that these are just kind of tukbandis having deviated from the forms of the poetry and the literary norms, and from meaning point of view, the theme point of view. So at one side is that. Then we have the kind of poetry I see on the social media. uh, uh, Everybody has a creative, means the creativity within the human being is a natural kind of thing, but the creativity also requires language, requires certain norms. If you are not aware of that, then the poetry will be also uh, in a bad shape that we generally see in social media.
Yeah,
That
actually,
one
that is a
starts,
peril of one of the
and
perils of
starts
social media.
writing poetry, but this has full of errors. So
So
that is
it is,
also
so
so I would basically recommend and request that you should read our classical poetry, whatsoever the language. That does not matter, but you must read it. For instance, Tagore has a very you can say acquaintance with the classical Persian poetry, and there is a deep influence on Tagore's poetry of Hafiz. His father was rather Hafiz of Hafiz. He memorized the whole Diwan of Hafiz, and even during at the time of his death, he asked the family members to recite Ghazal from Hafiz and from Bhagavad Gita. So that is the thing. The separation from the classic literature is a disastrous. Yeah,
yeah, so that's an interesting point. So you
yeah.
seem to, recommend that the reading of the classics will obviously, for obvious reasons, goes on to improve your own language, which becomes the tool for exploration of this poetic form.
Yes, yes,
So
exactly.
one last question that has come in is so you see that so this is a structured poem. So it's a
Yeah,
very carefully crafted two-line rendition of emotion. Uses a lot of rhetorical devices, shades of meaning. Usually seen as the second line is seen as a continuation of the first. Uh,
yeah.
are there any examples where rather than being a continuation, it is kind of a contrasting idea? And what are the could it be possible in that say? So
Yes,
you're
yes.
expect something like you're
There
expecting
are that
something and
kind
something
of.
else is.
For instance, uh, uh, बहुत मुश्किल है दुनिया का सवरना. ओके. तेरी जुल्फों का पेचो खम नहीं है. Okay, so these two verses apparently are in different meaning, contrasting, as well as also
Please
uh,
continue.
uh, yeah, yeah, uh, uh, connected with each other. Yeah.
Absolutely. So before concluding, so I just request the participants to fill up the feedback form, which will also enable us to give issue the certificates of participation, e-certificates of participation to you. So please fill up that, and yes, it has been a wonderful pre-afternoon, pre-lunch session for. For Professor Ahan recited so many of the couplets and dohas, and so it's like he covered a lot of ground, starting from the description, the definitions, the structure of the poem form, then went into the history, how it developed into a very preferred form of expression coming from the Persian and Arabic tradition, and then the Urdu and Hindavi tradition, the historical development, the subject matter, the genres, the variations of style, and how the descriptions of various different natures, of nature, of eroticism, of certain ambiguity of ideas. It emerged as a distinct form, and then he also delved upon the perils of taking uh, uh, taking in this kind of a craft to social media without knowing the technicalities of the genre. So it was, thank you, Professor Saab. It is a pleasure to host you here, and from the behalf of on the behalf of the organizers, the department, and all the people in the faculty and students, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for accepting this invitation to talk to us about such an interesting topic.
It was great
Thank you.
pleasure, and thank you for having me here, Professor Shantanu Ghosh, the Center of English Studies, Akal University, and the audience. It was pleasure being here. Thanks, Ani. indeed.
Thank you very much. Thanks.